The sky was dark with smoke and fire. For years, the rulers had taken everything from the people. They walked the earth as if it belonged only to them, and men and women had been forced to live in fear. Villages were burned, children were taken, and families were broken apart. The world was silent except for cries of pain, but in the ruins, there was one who would not kneel. Her name was Queen Evelyn. She had not been born to a throne, but she rose to it when no one else dared to stand. She carried in her heart the anger of every man and woman who had lost someone. She did not hide behind walls or guards. She walked among the broken, and they saw in her eyes a fire they had not seen before. When Daniel first met her, he was nothing more than a hunter who had lost his family. He carried an old blade and scars across his hands. He did not believe in hope anymore, but Queen Evelyn looked at him and said, "Your strength is not lost. Your fight has only just begun." Those words burned in him, and from that day he followed her. Chris was a builder, once proud of his craft. His home was destroyed, his tools broken, and his people gone. He thought he had no place left in the world. But Queen Evelyn told him that even broken tools could build weapons, and broken men could rise again. Chris bent steel with his hands, shaping blades and spears for the men who would join the fight. Laura had once been a teacher. She had no sword and no shield, but her mind was sharp. She had seen how the rulers moved, how they took control, how they forced men into silence. She told Queen Evelyn that order and plans would win more battles than fire alone. The queen listened, and Laura became her voice of reason when chaos grew. Nathan was the youngest of them, but his heart was full of rage. He had seen his brother fall, and since that day he lived only for battle. He carried no fear, only a will to strike. When Queen Evelyn placed a hand on his shoulder, she did not tell him to stop his anger. She told him to guide it. His anger became a weapon sharper than steel. Together they formed the first circle around the queen. They were not an army, not yet. They were men and women bound by pain, loss, and rage. The queen gave them one goal: to take back the food chain, to take back the world that had been stolen. Night after night they trained in the ruins. They lit no fires, spoke little, and waited for the day to strike. Daniel's sword cut through wood and stone. Chris shaped spears from iron scraps. Laura drew maps in the dirt, teaching them how to strike with fewer numbers. Nathan tested his strength by running through broken walls, his fists bleeding but never slowing. The queen watched them. She did not look at them as soldiers. She looked at them as family. She said they were the first flame, the spark that would turn into fire. Her voice carried across the camp. She told them that every man and woman had the right to live without chains. She told them that the rulers were not gods, that their time was over. And in the silence after her words, the men and women felt something they had not felt in years. It was not fear, it was not sorrow, it was the weight of war, and it was the promise of freedom. They were few, but they were ready. Daniel tightened his grip on his blade. Chris raised a spear. Laura lifted her maps from the dirt. Nathan clenched his fists until blood ran down his palms. And Queen Evelyn looked at them all with fire in her eyes. The night was coming to an end. The day of their first strike was near. The camp was silent before dawn. Every man and woman held their breath, waiting for the signal. The queen stood at the front with her cloak pulled tight against the cold wind. Her eyes never moved from the horizon. She had chosen this day for their first strike. She knew that if they failed, the dream of freedom would die with them. Daniel knelt beside her, sharpening his blade with steady hands. He did not speak, but his eyes told the queen he was ready. Chris held a spear in one hand and a sack of tools in the other. He had spent the night hammering iron into sharp tips, each one meant to pierce through steel. Laura sat with a map across her lap, whispering the plan one last time to Nathan, who paced back and forth with clenched fists. The queen raised her hand, and they moved like shadows into the broken streets. The ruins were cold and empty, but ahead of them stood the stronghold, where their enemies stored food and supplies. The queen had chosen it well. If they destroyed it, the rulers would feel fear for the first time. Laura whispered directions as they crept closer. She pointed to the walls and the towers, showing the weak points. Daniel led the way with his blade ready. Chris and Nathan carried bundles of oil and cloth, prepared to burn the storage chambers. The queen followed, her voice calm as she told each of them to stay strong. They reached the first wall. Daniel pressed his hand against the stone and listened. No sound came from inside. He signaled with a nod, and Nathan stepped forward. With one hard strike, he cracked the gate open wide enough for Chris to force in a wedge. Together they pushed until the wood broke apart. The group slipped inside. The air smelled of smoke and dust. Tall stacks of barrels and crates lined the hall. This was the food that had been taken from villages, food that should have fed children and families. The queen looked at it with cold eyes. She lifted her hand, and Chris began to scatter oil across the floor. Nathan climbed to the upper level, moving fast and silent. He carried fire in his hands. When he reached the top, he looked down and saw the others waiting. The queen gave him a single nod. Nathan threw the fire, and in a heartbeat the chamber lit up. Flames raced across the floor, climbing the walls and swallowing the stolen food. The sound of crackling fire broke the silence. Daniel shouted for the group to move out. They turned to leave, but a shout came from the far end. Armed men poured into the hall, their blades flashing in the firelight. The queen drew her sword without fear and charged forward. The clash was brutal. Daniel cut down the first man with a clean strike. Chris swung his spear and broke another to the ground. Laura, though she carried no weapon, threw stones from the rubble to give cover. Nathan leapt from above, landing hard and knocking two men aside. The queen moved through them with a fury none had seen before. Every swing of her sword was filled with the pain of years stolen from her people. The fire spread faster. The chamber shook as barrels exploded, sending sparks across the battlefield. The queen shouted for her warriors to hold the line. Daniel fought with blood running down his arm. Chris broke his spear and used the shaft as a club. Nathan's fists were red with cuts, but he never stopped striking. Finally, the last of the guards fell. Smoke filled the air, and flames roared against the walls. The queen gave the order to retreat. Together they pushed through the broken gate and back into the streets. Behind them, the stronghold burned until the night sky glowed red. When they reached the safety of the ruins, the queen looked at her men and women. Their bodies were cut and bruised, but their eyes shone with fire. She told them this was only the beginning. They had struck fear into the rulers, and from this day forward humanity would no longer hide. Daniel raised his blade. Chris lifted the broken shaft of his spear. Laura held her map high. Nathan clenched his fists once more. And Queen Evelyn stood tall, her voice carrying over the ruins, telling them that the war had just begun. The fire from the stronghold still burned in the distance when dawn came. Smoke curled into the sky, a mark that the world could no longer ignore. For the first time in years, the rulers had lost something of value. The strike had been small, but the message was clear. Humans were no longer prey. They were rising. Queen Evelyn gathered her warriors in the ruins of an old stone hall. The roof had fallen long ago, but the walls still stood, and inside she spoke to them. She told them that the victory was only the first step. Greater battles would come, and more men and women would need to join them. Her voice carried across the room with strength that made even the wounded stand taller. Daniel leaned against the wall with his blade resting at his side. His arm was wrapped in cloth, blood seeping through, but his eyes were sharp. He knew the next strike would be harder. Chris sat nearby, hammering a broken spear into shape, sparks flashing in the dark hall. Laura spread her maps across the floor, marking roads, rivers, and towers with lines of charcoal. Nathan paced back and forth, restless, his knuckles raw from the fight. The queen sent them into the villages. She told them to find the hidden, the lost, the broken, and bring them to her banner. Daniel traveled east, where he found men who had been hunters before the fall. Their bows had long been silent, but when he showed them his blade and spoke of the burning stronghold, their eyes lit with rage. They joined him without question. Chris went north, where blacksmiths had been forced to work for the rulers. He showed them the spear he had forged with his own hands. He told them they could shape weapons not for chains but for freedom. The blacksmiths turned their fires to war, hammering steel into blades for the queen's army. Laura walked west into the villages where mothers and children lived in fear. She spoke not with weapons, but with words. She told them the story of the fire, of how the queen had led her men into the stronghold and brought it down. She told them that no family would be safe until all stood together. Many who had hidden for years took up arms, ready to fight. Nathan went south, where he found young men filled with anger, their homes burned and families gone. He challenged them to tests of strength. He struck them, wrestled them, fought them one by one until their pride was broken. Then he told them their anger was wasted in the dirt when it could be used against their true enemy. They followed him back, bloody but loyal. Weeks passed, and the Queen's camp grew. Fires burned at night as new warriors trained. Blades clashed in the open fields. The sound of hammers rang through the air as smiths worked without rest. Men and women who once bowed their heads now stood tall. For the first time in generations, an army of humans was taking shape. But with growth came danger. Scouts returned with news that the rulers were moving in force. Large columns of armed men marched through the land, hunting for the rebels who had burned the stronghold. The Queen listened and gave no sign of fear. She told her warriors that the time of hiding was over. The war had begun, and the rulers would learn what it meant to fight humans who no longer bent the knee. Daniel sharpened his blade and swore to stand at the Queen's side until the last breath. Chris built stronger weapons, shaping shields and axes from the scraps of ruined cities. Laura prepared her maps for battle, marking where traps could be set and where rivers could be turned into barriers. Nathan trained the new recruits with fists and fury, breaking them down and rebuilding them into soldiers. On the night before the march, the Queen walked through the camp. She looked at every man and woman. She spoke no long words, only this: "Tomorrow we show them that we are not prey." Her warriors raised their weapons high, and the sound of their voices shook the ruins. The next day, the first true army of humans in centuries moved out under her banner. The march was long and heavy. Dust rose from the ground as hundreds of feet pressed forward. Men and women carried blades, spears, and shields made from broken iron. They were tired, but they walked with pride. At the front rode Queen Evelyn, her sword tied to her side, her eyes sharp as steel. Behind her walked Daniel, Chris, Laura, and Nathan, each ready for the coming fight. The scouts returned at dusk with grim news. A fortress lay ahead, filled with armed men waiting to crush them. The fortress guarded the main road, and without it they could not move deeper into the land. The Queen looked at the fortress from the hills. Its walls were high, its gates thick, and its towers full of watchmen. Still, she gave the order to attack. She said that fear had no place in their hearts. That night, the camp was restless. Warriors sharpened their blades in silence. Chris hammered dents from broken shields. Laura drew lines in the dirt, showing where the enemy would strike. Nathan walked among the men, shouting at them to stand firm, to fight like wolves, not lambs. Daniel sat with the Queen, his voice low, telling her that win or lose, he would never leave her side. Hey? She placed a hand on his shoulder and told him to fight without doubt. When dawn broke, the army moved. The fortress loomed ahead, its gates shut, its towers filled with armed men. The Queen raised her sword high and gave the signal. The human army charged forward with a roar that shook the ground. Arrows rained down from the towers. Shields lifted and men fell, but the charge did not stop. Daniel led the front line, his blade cutting through the first wave of guards. Blood stained his hands, but he pressed on. Chris carried a heavy hammer, striking the gate again and again until wood splintered under the force. Laura stood behind the lines, shouting orders, moving men where they were needed most. Nathan fought like fire, breaking through with fists and blade, dragging others forward with his fury. The battle raged through the morning. The ground was slick with blood, and the air filled with screams and steel. The Queen fought at the center, her sword flashing, her voice shouting orders that kept the men from breaking. Twice the enemy pushed them back, but each time they rose again. They fought not for land or gold, but for their right to live free. Hours passed, and the fortress still held. The gate was cracked but not broken. The men were weary, their arms heavy. Many had fallen, and still more would die if the gate did not fall soon. The Queen called Daniel, Chris, Laura, and Nathan to her side. She told them this was the moment. If the gate broke, the fortress would be theirs. If it stood, they would all perish. Daniel took his blade and led a charge straight at the gate. Chris swung his hammer with all his strength, wood breaking under every strike. Nathan climbed the wall with his bare hands, dragging 2 guards down as he went. Laura called the archers forward, raining arrows over the wall to cover them. The queen raised her sword and shouted for all to give everything they had. With one final strike, the gate split open. The army poured inside with a cry that shook the air. Daniel cut through the first line, Chris crushed the second, Nathan tore into the third. Laura's voice never stopped, guiding them through the chaos. The queen led them into the heart of the fortress, her sword striking down every guard in her path. By nightfall, the fortress burned. The enemy lay broken across the ground. The queen stood on the walls, her army below cheering her name. She told them this was proof that no chain could hold them, that no wall could stop them, that the food chain would be theirs again. The victory was theirs, but the cost was heavy. The dead were many, and the wounded filled the halls. The queen walked among them, her hands bloodied from battle, her face set with sorrow and fire. She knew this was only one step in a long war. Stronger enemies would come, but so would stronger humans. And so the queen swore that the fight would not end until every man and woman walked free. The fortress victory spread across the land like fire and dry grass. Villages whispered the name of Queen Evelyn. Men and women came from every direction, carrying blades, tools, or nothing but their bare hands. They came because they no longer wished to live in fear. The camp grew into an army stronger than any seen before. But with the rise of humans came a storm. Scouts returned with dark news. The rulers had gathered their greatest host. Thousands of armed men marched with shields, spears, and iron. They were moving toward the queen's army, and the final battle was close. The queen did not tremble. She stood before her warriors and told them the truth. She said the battle ahead would decide if humans rose or fell. She said that many would die, but their deaths would not be wasted, she said. This was the day they would take back their place in the world. Daniel listened in silence, his blade across his knees. Chris stood beside him, hammering the edge of a broken axe back into shape. Laura traced lines on her map, showing where the army must stand. Nathan clenched his fists, eager for the fight. Each of them carried scars, but each was ready for what was coming. The next dawn came with the sound of drums. The ground shook as the enemy host came into view. Their banners filled the horizon, their weapons flashing in the rising sun. The queen raised her sword high, her voice echoing across the fields. Her men and women roared in answer, lifting their blades to the sky. The clash began with a storm of arrows. Shields lifted, men fell, and the roar of battle filled the air. Daniel led the first charge, his sword cutting a path through steel and blood. Chris swung his hammer, breaking shields apart, his arms covered in dust and sweat. Laura stayed behind the line, shouting orders, guiding groups of men where the battle was thickest. Nathan tore into the enemy with wild rage, striking with fists and blade until the ground shook beneath him. The enemy pressed hard. Wave after wave crashed against the human line. The queen fought at the center, her sword moving with deadly force. Her cloak was torn, her face streaked with blood, but her voice never faltered. She shouted for her people to stand, to fight, to never bend. The battle lasted through the day. Men fell, women cried out, and still the line held. Smoke and fire rose across the field. Daniel fought until his arm could barely lift the blade, but he did not stop. Chris broke weapon after weapon, always finding something to strike with. Laura's voice grew hoarse, but her orders kept the army together. Nathan was a storm of rage, covered in blood, his eyes burning with fire. At last the queen saw the chance. The enemy center was weak. She raised her sword high and called for the final charge. Daniel roared and rushed forward. Chris lifted a shattered spear and followed. Laura pointed the way, guiding the charge. Nathan struck first, breaking through the line like a hammer through stone. The queen herself led the last push. She cut down every man before her, her army driving forward with all the strength left in their bodies. The enemy faltered, then broke. Men fled, weapons fell, and the field was theirs. When silence finally came, the queen stood on the hill with her sword raised high. Her army gathered around her, bloodied and broken but alive. She told them they had won more than a battle. They had won their place in the world. She told them no chain would ever bind them again. No wall would ever hold them back. From this day forward, humans would rule their own fate. Daniel dropped to one knee, his sword heavy but his heart strong. Chris placed his broken hammer at his side. Laura stood with her maps in hand, her eyes bright with fire. Nathan lifted his fists, shouting into the air. And Queen Evelyn stood above them all, her voice strong, her spirit unbroken. She had led them from fear to freedom. The rulers were broken, the food chain was theirs, and the world would never forget the day when humans declared war and won.